Good morning, everybody. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. My name is Antony Ball. I'm a director, non-executive director of the CDE and have been for some 15 years, and very honored to be chairing this session on a very important topic today. The CDE is, I'm sure, well known to many of you. It's an independent policy research and advocacy group and one of South Africa's leading think tanks. Since it was established some 30 years ago, it's been gathering evidence, generating innovative policy recommendations, and consulting widely on issues critical to economic growth, employment, and democratic consolidation. Ahead of the establishment of the Government of National Unity last year, the CDE set out to answer what is by far the most important question facing South Africa, and that is, what can our government do to get the country back on track after 15 years of stagnation and decline? For the past year, we've been collaborating with experts, business leaders, former public servants, lawyers, and others across our society in an initiative called Agenda 2024, Priorities for South Africa's New Government. CDE makes the case for a policy agenda that is substantially different from what we have seen from the government in the past. The 8 action reports which we've released so far each contain catalytic recommendations for the GNU in 5 vital areas, which we consider to be priorities. These reports and associated media briefings, interviews, and op-eds by CDE have resulted in extensive media presence and public response from well as unprecedented interest from ministers in the GNU and the NPA. Today, we're releasing the latest report in the series, which is Action 9, Use the Private Sector to Turbocharge the SEZ program. I'm going to hand over to Anne Bernstein, who's going to take us through a presentation on Action 9. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start sharing my slides. Where do I go? Yeah. Let me at the outset define what we mean by special economic zones. These are special zones in a country, geographic areas mainly, where different rules apply from those that apply in the rest of the economy, hence the adjective special. Well, what are the headlines of the presentation I'm going to make today as we release this new report? The first is that these zones have the potential to unblock 2 of South Africa's biggest national challenges, growth and jobs. When you look at our current zone program, in our view, it's misconceived and it's not delivering. Now, South Africa's not alone. Zones fail all over the world, but there are some important international successes that have been spectacular and that have really made an enormous difference to a country's economy and their future. We're going to make 2 bold proposals today about SEZs in the hopes that if these are adopted, they can help us move away from our current paralysis. Now, as you all know, South Africa is in deep trouble. Growth is stagnant and is much slower than our population growth, leading to more and more poverty. Unemployment is at catastrophic levels. In 10 years, we have moved from some 8 million people being unemployed to today, there are 12.3 million people who would like to work but cannot find a job. In our view, we have to build a much more labor-intensive and much faster growing economy. Now, in order to do that, we have to change. We have to adopt different policies and not double down on failing policies. Now, South Africa has had a high-wage, high-skill approach to building our economy since 1994. We have said, in effect, that no job is better than a low-paying job. And you can see the results, one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. We at CDE have a different view. Many successful countries, almost all that haven't found oil, have gone through a phase of a period of low-wage, low-skill work. And these have had spectacular results in some places. In South Africa, we think it's well past time we adopted a new approach for the workforce we actually have, and not this highly skilled one we wish we had. Now, we think special economic zones could be critical components of a new growth strategy. We could test out new policies, new approaches that are currently untenable for political or ideological reasons at a national level. And the international experience is instructive on what not to do and how to succeed. So we shouldn't build infrastructure and hope for the best, sort of build it and hope that investors will come. They don't. We shouldn't keep our special zones so similar to the rest of the economy that it hardly makes any difference and we don't attract new investment. And we shouldn't use zones in the hopes that they will help develop isolated, marginal, or sort of very poor regions of the country. That's not what these zones are about. If you want successful zones, the experience is very revealing. Firstly, your zone has to really be special, different from the rest of the economy. And you need to solve some of the problems and challenges that investors are identifying in the rest of the economy in order to attract them. The key issue is global competitiveness, not just a little bit better than the surrounding town or city's conditions, but globally competitive environment so that we can get into global markets. The flexibility and cost of labor really matters, especially when you're looking at low-skill manufacturing. And to succeed, special economic zones need political commitment at the highest levels. Now let's look at China, which is the most famous example. The earliest SEZ was in Shenzhen, and here's a picture of 1980, and then what's been achieved by 2025. Now, Shenzhen and other early special zones in China allowed foreign investors to operate with confidence after decades of national hostility to markets, to the foreign devil, and to capitalism. By opening up a few zones, Deng Xiaoping enabled investment, profit repatriation, and experimentation with liberalization. And this sparked massive growth without requiring full national reform. And they quickly became proof, the zones became proof on the ground that even limited areas of the country with different rules can bring real change. Let's look at Mauritius, closer to home. Export processing zones in the 70s were established to create space for export-focused manufacturing, despite the vested interests who didn't want change. By doing this, they were able to lower tariffs, introduce flexible labor rules, and wage exemptions. They unleashed a garment industry that was globally competitive. And unemployment fell from the early 70s, from 25% 3% to full employment in 1987. What about the performance of South Africa's SEZ program? Well, we have 12 designated zones at the moment. Four of these have attracted meaningful investments, and these are there. But if you look at this, the public investment, your and my tax money, of about 28 billion has not led to multiples of private investment. The latest figures indicate we have about 216 companies which have invested 31 billion rand, almost equal to the public investment. And we have created some 27,000 jobs. There's no evidence that the money spent has been significant in attracting investment or creating additional jobs, really. Let's take Coega as an example. This is the first, the largest and most expensive of the country's special economic zones, established in 2011. It has excellent infrastructure that cost billions of rand. It's still mostly empty, just bare felt if you go and visit. They claim to host 63 operational companies that have created 10,500 jobs. Most of these companies have relocated from elsewhere in South Africa, so they are not new businesses. And we're told that some companies today are barely operational. Our government hoped that Coega would become a critical hub in the development and industrialization of the region. This has not happened. The truth is that our special economic zone program has failed. It has not revitalized the manufacturing sector. It's not promoted export-oriented industries and services. It's not generated large numbers of jobs, and it has not developed economically marginal areas. So what should we do? We have two big proposals to transform stagnant industrial parks into powerful engines of economic growth and employment. Our first proposal: establish an experimental, a pilot special economic zone, which should be a potential laboratory for labor-intensive manufacturing. This zone should be in Coega. As I've said, the infrastructure is built and paid for. It's mainly empty. It has a special port. The workforce nearby has some industrial experience, which is unusual globally for a zone of this kind. And with Motherwell Township right nearby, there are workers close by and in the city and surrounding region. This area is a globally competitive environment for managers, also unusual in the developing world. We should establish a special zone. So what are we saying needs to be different? Well, wages and working conditions should be negotiated at factory levels. Only firms engaged in new activities and only for export. We want duty-free imports, and we want relaxed restrictions for skilled foreign managers in running factories, low-skill factories, and in inserting their products into the global marketplace. And lastly, we are suggesting it should be managed by a private sector commercial entity, of which there are many. This could be an ideal test bed for labor-intensive manufacturing. We are not calling for sweeping national labor law reform. We are saying we want basic health and safety regulations to continue and to be enforced. We want exemption for these factories from collective bargaining agreements, exemption from the Labor Relations Act's dismissal provisions. And employees should get the national minimum wage, and the employment tax incentive would help lower employers' wage costs to make this globally competitive. And we really want to test our proposition. Can South Africa compete in global low-skill manufacturing? That's what this pilot would be about. Now, CDE is not alone in calling for something like this, and increasingly there are more voices in support of this kind of idea. The National Treasury in 2019 said that there's a need for more experimentation and piloting of industrial policy options. Special economic zones can be effective tools in this regard. The ANC Economic Transformation Committee in 2020 said that the country needs to identify opportunities in low-end manufacturing that it can exploit to the full. Joel Nitsatenzi, a senior member of the ANC, former very senior member of government, has also said that in his view, through appropriately designed and located special economic zones, we can take advantage of the offshoring that is currently happening from China. Mcebisi Jonas, former Deputy Minister of Finance, now Chairman of MTN, has also said the private sector has a deep understanding of markets and supply chain dynamics and needs to be central to our industrialization ambitions. The Chinese model of piloting new policy in demarcated zones is something we should consider strongly. Now, there are critics of this approach of a low-skill manufacturing zones, but in our view, these critics are wrong. We are not advocating sweatshops for South Africa, and as I've said, we want basic health and safety rules to apply. Many people say, a very senior official said this to us late last year, you want my children to work for very low wages. And I think the response to that is one by the former president of Mexico, who had similar criticisms launched at him. And he said, many people think the choice is between low wages and high wages. In fact, in Mexico, and we would argue in South Africa, the choice is between low wages or no wages at all. And that's often forgotten when people are thinking about this issue. The last point I want to make can be seen very clearly in China. One looks at these factories and tends to see low wages and not much opportunity. In fact, this is wrong. The experience of China in the last 25, 30 years is that wages go up. And that's why lots of factories have moved out of China to Bangladesh, to Vietnam, to Laos, to Cambodia, and elsewhere, because wages and conditions have improved so much in that country. This is not a story of exploitation. It is a story of expanding opportunity for the individuals who get jobs in these factories and can slowly move from making the most basic t-shirt to making a men's shirt, or becoming a supervisor of people making t-shirts, to the firms close by, to successful zones. Local firms can learn from international expertise and globally competitive factories. They can start participating in their value chain, and they can start sort of applying their methods and developing their own factories, which is certainly what's been happening in Bangladesh and many other places. How do we make this happen? It seems to us that this would be an ideal project for the government of national unity. Something new to do together. For this to succeed, we need champions. We need political champions and we need private sector champions. We need senior politicians to promote a zone like this when they visit China and Asia. And we need senior executives in the private sector to use their Asian contacts to promote investment in this kind of a zone. And then we need to tender for an experienced zone operator, most likely internationally, where there are many companies that specialize in establishing or improving zones, and they run them, they market them for profit. So that's our first proposal for action. Our second proposal concerns the SEZ program overall. We want to unleash private sector energy and know-how to help drive this program. Let businesses take the risks and chase new investment. So we want to create space for bold new ideas and different ideas from what we've had in the past. Now, globally, there's an increasing move that best practice involves private sector management and ownership of these zones. Let me give you a few examples. From Colombia, for example, privately initiated and managed zones were allowed in the late 1990s when the law was changed. And the largest zone in Bogota houses over 400 companies, mostly foreign-owned. There's a private group that now operates over 40 special economic zones, generating $23 million in FDI annually. Take Turkey. Private operators can develop zones on public or private land, investing in infrastructure and managing operations. The Aegean Free Zone, run by a private company, is Turkey's most successful SEZ. In 2023, it hosted over 190 firms, employed nearly 25,000 people, and generated just under $6 billion in trade. The Dominican Republic also had a failing or flailing SEZ program run by the state. They changed this, and privately owned SEZs were approved by an independent council. The economic impact of these zones is now 10 times greater than the incentives provided by government. And the zones in the Dominican Republic compete to attract investors and workers. There are also some African countries that are experimenting with privately initiated and managed zones in Kenya, Ghana, and Morocco. So we're saying that South Africa should overhaul its national SEZ program and move away from a state-driven approach. We should open up to private companies, and private companies should share in profits and losses involved in running the zones. So let the private sector take the risk: ownership, management, and marketing. How do we make this happen? Well, we have to reconstitute the SEZ advisory board, more entrepreneurs and private sector people, and a few officials. We need to open up to proposals for privately run SEZs. We need to adopt new, more flexible criteria for approval, allow the private provision of reliable power, water, and other services, and focus on attracting new investment, ideally for exports. In our view, if SEZs were restructured to attract investors in this way, we could increase FDI, create thousands of jobs, boost exports, and integrate South Africa into global value chains. And we can demonstrate that market-driven approaches can effectively drive growth and industrialization. So in sum then, we're saying we need to change if we want better results. There's a big opportunity at Coega, and we need to reconceive our SEZ program nationally. Now, everybody wants growth and jobs. Everyone you meet, every politician, everybody in the government, in the private sector, everybody wants growth and jobs. But nobody really wants to change. In our view, South Africa is paralyzed on labor market reform and how to achieve faster growth that creates jobs for the workforce we have today. A reconceived SEZ program has real potential to help drive reform speedily and attract new foreign investment. Our two proposals offer an exciting way forward. Let's not miss this opportunity to turbo boost reform. And you have to ask yourself, what do we have to lose? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ant, for the great presentation. Very fulsome and loaded with deep thoughts and lots of possibilities. I'm going to now open this to a small panel for any thoughts, reflections, or comments that they may have. And if I can start off with Mr. Tumelo Chipfupa, please, if you're able to introduce yourself and give us your thoughts and comments, given your experience in these matters.
Thank you, Antony. My name is Tumelo Chipfupa. I am with EY, the auditing company. I was previously with the Department of Trade and Industry, and I worked with on the SEZ program at the DTIC. I want to start maybe my comments by commending the CDE on an excellent report. I think it highlights critical reforms that, if implemented, could significantly enhance the SEZ program's contribution to economic growth. After the recent budget fallout, it's clearer that we need fundamental reforms like the ones in this report. We need them to generate the resources that we need to improve living standard, transformation, and redress. I would strongly recommend that the Government of National Unity should take this report very seriously. Just to comment on some of the big themes in the report, private sector participation. I think we all know that government doesn't have the funds to keep expanding the SEZ program on its own. Managers of existing zones, some of whom are on this call, will tell you lack of funding is a real constraint to their work. And that's where the private sector can come in. It can bring in much needed investment. But it's not just about money. Having the private sector involved will also ensure that new SEZs are well thought out. Right now, as noted in the report, we don't have a strong process to test whether new SEZ proposals are even bankable. If the private sector is going to put up money, they will want to share risk, but they will only do so for projects that have a decent chance of success. That alone will raise the quality of the proposals for new SEZ. The private sector will also bring in skills and efficiency. Unlike China in the late 1980s, South Africa does have a private sector with industrial park management experience. China, we should remember, did not have a private sector when they started on their road with SEZ, and hence government tended to do real estate management. It does not make sense in South Africa for government to be going around and creating real estate management companies in each province. It makes much more sense to let the private sector handle zones and free the provincial governments on urgent services that can only be performed by government. I'm also fully on board with the idea of piloting a labor-intensive zone within the Kuga SEZ. SN has said the beauty of the SEZ is the ability to test ideas in a controlled environment. They are like laboratories for identifying and overcoming growth constraints. There are many theories or stories on why we have such stubborn structural unemployment in South Africa. Some stories are about rigid labor laws and strong unions. Other stories talk about lack of skills, yet other stories point to the high reservation wages that workers have as a result of general social grants. That is the idea that workers will only accept a minimum wage that is higher because they have social grants to fall back on. There was a time when I was in government when these types of debates on what is really the main constraints to employment took up a lot of time. Most of the time, officials, academics, and analysts preferred one story or one theory over the other because it aligned with their personal values. I personally think that all of these stories may have merit depending on where and what sector you look at. The report's recommendation for labor-intensive zone within Kuga appears to be anchored around the story or theory that a big cause of structural unemployment is the inflexibility of labor laws and strong unions. Like I said, it's a theory that needs to be taken seriously and have its validity tested. I would like to add, though, that recent work from economists at the Harvard Kennedy School shows that many poor workers in South Africa live far from job sites due to apartheid-era municipal spatial planning. Direct transport costs can eat up to 30% of a worker's wage, and this percentage goes up to 80% when the monetary value of time spent traveling to and from work is taken into account. Low-wage workers in particular tend to use the most inefficient transport modes and spend longer time traveling to and from work. The impact of this is that it also increases the wages that workers are willing to settle for, and it sets them at levels that are much higher than what companies can afford. So in addition to the report's proposal, I would add that around this labor-intensive economic zone, we need to make sure that we optimize public transport. The report correctly notes that within the PE area and Motherwell, there's a rich history of workers and who have industrial experience. But Motherwell and the PE area, it's a wide and sprawling area. And it can be especially daunting to travel from one part of PE or Motherwell to the Kuga SEZ if one doesn't have a car. We could improve on this experiment by making sure that public transport makes travel to and from work cheaper and faster. And as part of this experiment, we can monitor the results with the hope that we gain real insights into how transport impacts unemployment. Lastly, I think we should not look at this experiment as a way of confirming our pre-existing biases on what accounts for high levels of unemployment. We should design the experiment and approach it with an open mind and a genuine solution-seeking attitude. The big question that we obsess with should be about what can we learn about the policy prescriptions that are necessary to create employment on a massive scale and take South Africa out of its structural unemployment. To wrap up, I think the report offers smart and actionable recommendations. If the GNU is serious about tackling structural unemployment and boosting the SEZ program, this is a great place to start. Thank you so much for the attention, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chipfupa. That was very, very good to have your wisdom and experience reflect on this. Thank you very much for your comments, which have been very helpful. I'm going to now ask one of our corporate captains, Saki Macozoma, who hails from the region, has some perspectives on the project. I can also ask Saki, please, first to welcome you and thank you very much for joining us, and ask if you can give us some thoughts and reflections on this report.
I'm sorry, I was muted.
If we can hear you now, Saki. Thank you. Can you
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'm okay now. I can see.
Yes, we got you. Thanks, Saki.
I am at a slight disadvantage in the sense that I didn't hear all of the input that Anne made. But having been part of these processes in the past, this seems to me to be a continuation of work that come as far back as 2019, when this idea was first put on the table and discussed. And I happened to be in one of the meetings in Port Elizabeth at that time, where this idea was discussed. I think that it makes such common sense to embark on something like this, that some of the arguments for it tend to be banal in a sense, but there's also such emotion around these kinds of issues from certain sectors of the union movement, as well as the political parties, ranging from the Alliance and others. But I think that the situation in that area in particular is so dire in terms of the unemployment that we really have to try and push this thing, irrespective of the opposition that we are likely to get. The point about the population there being used to industrial work is true, but in reality now, we are probably in the third or fourth decade of serious and deep unemployment. If I look back to the PE I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and today, and maybe even the situation in the 80s, every other home in the township had a working member working in an industrial job, mostly in the car industry and all of its feed industries, or working at the post office, or working at the railways, or working at some other parastatals. Now, when you look back, if you look at, let's just start with the parastatals. There are most of those parastatals no longer exist, like the post office. I remember the people used to work, it was called the GPO then. Low-skilled labor, and it was employment for people, but it is no longer in existence in reality. The railways employed a lot of people. I have some experience in what happened in the railways because of the overemployment that had happened there, and also all of the other newer problems that we have. So there is no employment. So if we don't do something now, what is going to happen is that the advantage of people with experience in working in an industrial setting are actually dying off. And there are people who have not been in employment all their lives, And I think at least a minimum of 2 to 3 decades of people who have not been in employment of any kind. And I think, therefore, if this is not tried on an urgent basis, the relative advantage that the PE area has will continue to erode, and in fact, it will go away. Of course, the issue that we have to contend with is the opposition that we are likely to get. And that opposition, as Anna put it, the idea that it's better not to work than to work for low wages, and that in fact this is the thin edge of the wedge that capitalists or capital is trying to push in, so that all of the gains, quote unquote, of the labor movement are reversed. I think we have to deal with this perception very strenuously, and make people understand that if we don't do something and do it urgently, what we're going to have in that area is the level of violence that we have as we speak, and the level of decay, urban decay that we're finding, because the city is does not have the resources to do some of the simple things that it should be doing in terms of services. And I guess the question then is, where does one start? I think that probably we need to do public dialogue and actually educate people about the potential advantages of a project of this nature. And it's going to take time to get there, even though the situation is urgent. But I think we need to identify those sectors of society in the area that actually can create the opportunity or the space to put this proposal on the table and to work through it, and to anticipate also some of the challenges that that may arise. And I take the point about, for instance, the transport to the area. Fortunately, PE is not as widespread as Gauteng is, and I think that Kucha is the best place where this can be experimented on. What I fear about the area also is the fact that the motor industry, which has always been the backbone of that region, is a sunset industry. When you think about the future of the internal combustion engine, and there is nothing, to my knowledge, that is being contemplated as to how those jobs that will disappear with the disappearance of the internal combustion engine, what are the new jobs are going to be. And I think there are opportunities also for offshoring for the Chinese, because the Chinese, besides the labor issues, I mean the cost of labor in China, they also have to respond to the Americans in the sense that if they want to sell to Europe and those parts of the world that are outside of the sanctions of the United States, they need to relocate some of their industries in places that are friendlier shores than the US and its allies. And therefore, there is opportunity still to find the kinds of industries that can be located in that zone, particularly the labor-intensive ones. I will pause there for now.
Saki, thank you very much for your very thoughtful comments, adding some important strategic imperatives to why this should be taken seriously. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to question and answer session now. And the way I'm going to try and do that is people have given a lot of questions online. I think there are about 14 of them. And rather than read them out, it seems like that they're grouped into a number of themes, which I'll try to authentically reflect in questions I pose, and first to you, and if you want to direct them to anyone else, I'll leave it for you to do that. But I think the first theme that comes through is one that relates to what does one mean by private sector ownership, and some confusion about private sector involvement in a business in one of these SEZs, or versus the management of the whole of a zone or zones. If someone can just amplify that, I think that will clear up some of the questions that have come through on the wires here.
If I may, oh, sorry. Okay,
sorry, Saki. No,
now, if in my understanding, I think that there are two issues. One is the management of the real estate side, which is managing the SEZ itself, as opposed to some kind of parastatal or a division of a city or whatever instrument is being put there. In other words, that the demarcated area is managed by a company that understands what is required in the SEZ and does so efficiently. The other part of it is the companies that invest, which will invest for profit, who must find the markets, who must find the capital, who must find the management for their own companies. So for me, those are the two parts of this question of the private sector involvement.
Thank you, Saki. And anything you want to add to that?
no, I think that's exactly right. It's a private company running the zone for profit, and whatever they think needs to be done to attract investment internationally and locally, different from the firm itself.
I think that relates to that is the question about how is it currently done. Perhaps Tumelo would be the best person to answer that. It's currently, my guess, is being done by DTIC or some agency of state.
Yeah. Currently, what is happening is that it's all the zones are developed and managed by provincial entities. So, almost each and every province, government goes through this very long process of setting up a company, which is owned by a provincial economic department. And then that company then goes about in receiving funds from government and then, putting up a plan, developing the zone, going to attract investor. And so the government does both zone development and zone management. Yeah, and I think my understanding also of what is being proposed is that we would let zone development and zone management be also handed over to the private sector. I don't think that government will be out of the picture. I think in the spirit of making them special zones, they will still need incentives. You will still need regulation of these areas and so forth. So that there is still a role for government, but I think we would let government do what government does best and bring in expertise from the private sector for them to do what most probably they are much more better positioned to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Tumelo. There are a few questions relating to a wish to see some of this expanded into small initiatives in towns and cities, and the possible role of local authorities in such initiatives. I think this stems from seeing positive here, but how could that also be expanded into towns and areas around the country? And are you able to offer anything on that?
Yes. So there is talk in government, it's not firm policy yet, that there should be 5 more zones for each province. And that would be decided by the local authority or the province. We're saying turn this around. If somebody, for example, I see one of the questions, would like to do a zone in Johannesburg, in the inner city of Johannesburg. Our idea is you've got to restructure the zoning board, the board who decides about this, and clarify the clear criteria. But if a private operator comes along, perhaps with municipal support, and says, we want to make a zone, and this is why it will be special. This is why it will attract investment that's different from the rest of the city economy or the metro economy or the national economy. That should be decided on its merits. Now, I think it's important not just to use the idea of a zone to apply to everything. So the notion is a special economic zone to get investment that we don't have at the moment and more jobs. And it could be, many of these are mainly low-skill manufacturing, but it could be something else. You could say we want a precinct of the city, which is a different concept, to focus on education issues, for instance, and think about what those education institutions need. But I think that's a slightly different idea from these special economic zones. But if private players want to take the risks, then, and it's a sensible idea, this should be considered by this reconstituted board with a lot more entrepreneurs on it, not only government people, but there do need to be some government people involved as well.
Thank you. And we have a question which I read in is, thank you for the informative panel. Is there a particular sector or industry that would be targeted? As SEZs are usually export zones, presumably an industry that aligns with SA's comparative advantage would be ideal. Secondly, how would the global supply chain for the industry be attracted in terms of incentives and policy adjustments? There's quite a lot there, but maybe you have a few comments to offer.
Look, we've mainly spent a lot of time thinking hard about the low-skill manufacturing, which would be basic garments, but it could also be toy assembly. And in time, as you see in Bangladesh, they're also doing assembly of electronic goods, which would be a next level up, slightly better wages and so on. And that would be that kind of a value chain. That's where we've focused our efforts. That's not to say those are the only kind of zones South Africa should go for. There could be other kinds of zones, but they need to be economically sensible. We shouldn't use zones to develop poor regions of the country, but if there's a sector of South Africa and entrepreneurs who think they can attract investment to a zone of a different kind, then they should design one like that. But our expertise has mainly been in low-skill manufacturing, and that's where we've been looking. There is talk of a sort of green zone, but we don't know enough about that, and that would need to be designed specially to see what you could do. And Ricardo Hausman has put some ideas on the table in that area, although this needs further development. I know there's a talk about mining and beneficiation and so on, and I think the point we're making is if the private sector wants to take the risk, and there's an entrepreneur or a set of entrepreneurs that want to take the risk for a particular zone, that makes sense. It's their money and let them do it. And then they would, to answer the second part of the question, how do you get the investment that we need? Well, we would be relying on the private entity to do that. And where appropriate, we could be looking to South African companies and all the connections they would have in Asia, where people, as Saki pointed out, people are looking for a China +1 policy, which might be heightened in the current environment. And politicians who are visiting various countries could be selling the benefits of, for example, Kucha to people. So, but the whole thrust of what we're saying is that the private company or set of entrepreneurs, they must take the risk, they must decide this is a viable proposition, and then they work out how to attract investment into that zone, and they have an interest in doing that. I don't know if other members of the panel want to come in, but that's how I would see it.
I'd just like to make maybe one slight comment. I think one of the things that I particularly like about the report, it's on the emphasis on experimentation and on learning. And I think that the recommendation of bringing in, we should look at the recommendation of bringing in the private sector, of, renegotiating or slightly tinkering with labor laws inside the SEZ as experimentation, and what will work, what will not work. I don't think that we can know ahead of time. Even the Chinese, if one looks at the history of Chinese zones, it's not like we see Shenzhen today and we marvel at the foresight of Deng Xiaoping. They experimented it. And I think there's a saying that Deng Xiaoping liked to make, to say that, we cross the river by feeling the stones. You experiment, you adjust, and you change. The main thing is that you are experimenting, you've got an open mind, you've got your goal and your focus is to create lots of jobs that are labor intensive for the people that you have and not for the people that you want to have. And as long as we've got that open approach and learning approach, I think, it's something that's gonna take us. And then there's other thing is that I think that from a government perspective, it may be useful to actually put in quite a lot of focus on an experiment like that than spreading yourself too thinly and having lots and lots of SEZ all over the place, because it's better to create some focus, get to learn new lessons, and when you roll out something that has worked at least in one place. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I just want to comment by saying, one of the difficulties we have, and I agree with Tumelo about, don't spread yourself too thinly. But let's take, for instance, the Eastern Cape. There is Gucha, and a lot of investment has been made there. And then whilst you're still trying to make that work, East London comes up and says, we need an SEZ too. And then you have Gucha and the East London SEZ competing. There may be good reason for that. But I think that politicians need to really take a different view. We need to have a country view or a province view as to what is most efficacious. Because if we are going to sell investment and you are, say, the Premier of the Eastern Cape, and you got 2 or 3 SEZs to speak about or speak to, I think the message gets diluted, and somehow we really have to understand that people are not bound to specific areas, and if the one in East London works and works better on something, it's fine. The people from the PE area should not feel bad about that, and should actually help. But I think too many can make a difference. So that, in my view, there's a whole mind shift that is required on this at this time.
Thank you, Saki. I think this gets to the couple of questions that touch on this point about mindset, which is referred to here as ideology. And maybe this is a question again best put back to Tumelo, who's been a senior person at DTIC. Some of this is about ideology, and it's quite interesting in the opening part of the presentation where Ants spoke about one of the big changes in China was they're starting out with hostility to capital and then opening up. And similarly here, when one talks about private sector engaging in these sorts of activities, one does often come across this in government's opposition to it. And perhaps this is a point worth addressing when one's proposing private sector involvement in what is essentially a state-driven thing. Tumelo, what are your thoughts about the receptiveness of government to some sort of mindset change, which is essentially what's being proposed here?
Yeah, I think yeah, even at the time when the SEZ Act was being drafted, if one looks at the SEZ Act, you see that it makes reference to PPPs, but it stays away from allowing the private sector on their own to manage and run zones. So there was quite a lot of debate, and I think that there was a misunderstanding, or there was that feeling that, you know, this should be a government thing. It should be run by government. It's always run by government and so forth. But I get the sense that it's changing, and that mindset within government and within government officials is changing, in the sense that we are beginning to see the private sector, a lot of things being opened into the private sector, especially of an infrastructure kind. Power, we're seeing rail now being open to the private sector. And so I tend to think, or I'm hopeful, that this idea now of opening the SEZ to the private sector, because it's something that's happening all around the world, and the report points to some real experiences in middle-income countries. I think it's something that maybe may stand a chance of being getting a hearing now, and yeah, and I think the CDE is on the right track of making that recommendation. And the other thing is that the government doesn't really have the resources, or the government is fiscally constrained. It cannot continue funding this on its own, and by bringing in the private sector, it will be expanding on the pool of resources that are available to invest in SEZ. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. There's a question. With the automotive sector being in sunset, how can government leverage on the wave of ICEs to manage just transition? A lot of efforts are being made by SEZ to promote their offerings. However, the need for a concerted and deliberate move to repurpose the auto sector is now. In line with the experimentation of PSPs to avert job losses, the time is now to leverage on US-China manufacturing pendulums. I think it ties in with the comments that the Saki made. So it seems like that's been answered. Unless you want to add anything more to that, Anne?
Well, perhaps I can add this, that the automotive sector has been the single largest recipient of government subsidy for a very long time. And the last review of the automotive sector and its contribution to the national economy was in 2008, which interestingly it was an independent review that came to the conclusion that it was a net cost to the economy and society rather than a net benefit. And in the context of both the whole question of new kinds of vehicles and the green energy and moving towards electric vehicles or wherever we end up, plus China sort of taking over the market in a very serious way, we have called for a review of the automotive sector and the subsidies that we give. So that's just background to this. We do think it's important to have a totally independent review on how much money we spend on this sector and what does South Africa get in return. And it is a cost-benefit analysis that needs to take into account sunk investment, but also where are we going with this? So I think it's a very opportune time to do this, and that would affect at least one of the big zones. So I would just add that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I've gone through the questions. I think there are a lot of comments in there which would be helpful. I don't think we need to respond to them. There are I think we've covered the themes that have come through, certainly most of them in the questions. So I'm going to suggest that we let you make some closing remarks, and then we wrap up.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to our panel for the really insightful and helpful comments about our report. The report is on our website. Please read it, discuss it. We really would like to take this, especially this experimental zone at Coega, further. And if anyone has contacts in the region or ideas of how we could do that, we would really appreciate that, in terms of what Saki was talking about, the politics of this and how we could actually get local players to see the advantage of something like this for themselves, and then how to get the space from national government. So that's really all I want to say about this. I agree with what Chipfupa and Tumelo is saying, is that we don't know how to grow South Africa. We all have views, and strong views at that, but here is a chance for an experiment, and it needs to be seen in that way. And what we want is the space to do something like this and learn from it. And there might be other areas where you can experiment with other things, but that's what we want to. We think the time is ripe to do something like this, and we should move as quickly as possible. So let me end there, and we've learned a lot from both the questions and the comments from the panel.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks to everyone who's participated. Just from us, I'd also want to just pick up on some of the themes that particularly Saki and Tumelo raised with us after the presentation. And for me, the ones that first one that Saki made was, this is very rational in response to what we know about taking place in South Africa, but very specifically, Saki and I are kind of fellows in terms of age and from the same place, so we know the region really well. It's been devastated by the deindustrialization. That just so many unemployed people, and